February 1943. Tunisia. The mountain pass near Kasserine. A line of German half-tracks sits motionless in the mud. Their engines growl. Their tracks spin uselessly. The winter rains have turned the narrow trail into a river of clay. The vehicles, built for the open steppes of Russia, sink deeper with every attempt to move forward. Then, from behind the American lines, a sound. Not the roar of tanks. Not the rumble of artillery. A high-pitched whine. Almost toy-like. A small, square vehicle bounces over the rocks. 4 wheels. Open top. No armor. It looks like a child's drawing of a car. A German officer lowers his binoculars and laughs. The jeep doesn't stop. It churns through the mud the half-tracks couldn't cross. It climbs the incline their engineers said was impossible. It disappears over the ridge, carrying ammunition to American troops the Germans thought were cut off. The laughter stops. One vehicle. 60 horsepower. A quarter ton of steel and canvas. It would change the war. The jeep was born from desperation. In the summer of 1940 the world was burning. France had fallen in 6 weeks. The British were retreating across the Channel. Poland, Denmark, Norway swallowed whole. The German blitzkrieg wasn't just a tactic. It was a revolution. Speed. Mobility. Mechanized infantry moving faster than any army in history. America watched from across the ocean. The U.S. Army had 130,000 men. Smaller than Portugal's military. Its vehicles were relics from the First World War, clumsy trucks, unreliable motorcycles, and a cavalry that still rode horses into the field. If war came, and everyone knew it would, the American military would be outrun before the first shot was fired. In July 1940, the Army's Quartermaster Corps issued a request. They needed a lightweight reconnaissance vehicle. Something fast. Something that could go anywhere. It had to weigh less than 1,300 pounds. Carry a crew of 3. Have 4-wheel drive. A flat hood for mounting a machine gun. And it had to be delivered in 49 days. No American company had ever built anything like it. 135 manufacturers received the invitation. Only 2 responded. The first was American Bantam Car Company, a tiny firm in Butler, Pennsylvania, barely surviving the Great Depression. They'd been making small economy cars that no one wanted. Their lead engineer, Karl Probst, worked 72 hours straight, sketching designs on hotel stationery. He had no prototype. No funding. Just desperation and a deadline. Bantam delivered the first vehicle on September 23, 1940. It weighed 1,840 pounds, over the limit, but it worked. The test drivers took it through mud, sand, and gravel. They drove it up a flight of stairs. They rolled it into a ditch and drove it back out. It didn't break. The Army was impressed. But they didn't trust Bantam to produce thousands of vehicles. The company was too small. Too fragile. So the Army did something ruthless. They handed Bantam's blueprints to 2 larger companies, Willis Overland and Ford Motor Company, and told them to build their own versions. Willis refined the design. They added a more powerful engine, the Go Devil 4-cylinder, producing 60 horsepower. It could reach 55 miles per hour on flat ground. Ford streamlined the production process, using interchangeable parts that could be assembled in factories from Detroit to Richmond. By the summer of 1941, the Jeep, officially designated the Willis MB and Ford GPW, was in mass production. The name itself was a mystery. Some said it came from GP, for general purpose. Others claimed it was from Eugene the Jeep, a cartoon character that could go anywhere and do anything. The soldiers didn't care. They just called it the Jeep. It was ugly. Boxy. Exposed. No doors. No comfort. A windshield that folded flat to avoid reflecting sunlight. Seats that felt like park benches. In the summer it baked you. In the winter it froze you. It was loud, cramped, and shook like a paint mixer on rough terrain. But it went everywhere. Could ford streams 30 inches deep. Climb a 60% grade. Turn in a 17-foot circle. It carried radios, stretchers, ammunition, water, and men. It could mount a .30 caliber machine gun on the hood or a .50 caliber on a rear pedestal. It was a scout car, an ambulance, a supply truck, and a weapons platform, all in one. And America could build them faster than any other country could build anything. By December 1941, when Japanese bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, the United States was already producing Jeeps by the thousands. Ford's River Rouge plant alone could turn out 1 Jeep every 80 seconds. Willis was churning out hundreds per day. The assembly lines ran 24 hours. Farmers, teachers, women who'd never worked in factories, they all became riveters and welders, bolting together the vehicle that would carry American soldiers across every battlefield on Earth. The Germans didn't notice at first. In Berlin, German intelligence analysts looked at photographs of the Jeep and dismissed it. They saw a light vehicle with no armor, no enclosed cabin, a tiny engine. To men trained in the doctrines of panzer warfare, it looked like a toy. The German military philosophy was built on specialized engineering, vehicles designed for specific tasks, crafted with precision. The Kübelwagen, their own light vehicle, was rear-wheel drive and built like a Volkswagen Beetle. It worked well on European roads. The SD, KFZ 251 half-track was a marvel of German engineering, tracked rear wheels for cross-country mobility, armored hull for protection. But they were complicated. They required trained mechanics. Spare parts were difficult to manufacture. Each vehicle was a small masterpiece, and masterpieces take time. The Jeep was the opposite. It was designed to be simple. Any mechanic with basic tools could fix it. Parts were interchangeable between Willis and Ford models. If the engine failed, you could swap in a new one in under an hour. If a wheel broke, you bolted on another. There were no intricate systems. No delicate components. Just steel, bolts, and gasoline. This was the American way of war. Not elegance. Not perfection. Mass production. Overwhelming numbers. If one Jeep broke, there were 10 more behind it. If a part failed, there were crates of replacements stacked at every supply depot. The Germans built machines that worked beautifully, until they didn't. The Americans built machines that worked adequately, always. In November 1942, the Jeep went to war. Operation Torch. The Allied invasion of North Africa. Tens of thousands of American and British troops stormed ashore in Morocco and Algeria, driving east toward Tunisia. The terrain was unlike anything the U.S. Army had faced before. Coastal roads turned into sand traps. Inland trails became boulder fields. The Atlas Mountains loomed in the distance, their peaks dusted with snow. German forces were already there, veterans of Rommel's Afrika Korps, tanned and hard from 2 years of desert combat. They had Panzer IIIs and IVs. They had 88mm anti-aircraft guns repurposed as tank killers. They had experience. The Americans were green. Most had never seen combat. Their tanks, M3 Lee and early M4 Shermans, were unreliable in the sand. Their supply lines stretched across hostile terrain. Their commanders were still learning how to fight a mechanized war. But they had Jeeps. Thousands of them. Jeeps raced ahead of the main columns, scouting enemy positions. They carried messages when radios failed. They hauled ammunition under fire. They pulled wounded men out of burning tanks and drove them to field hospitals 20 miles behind the lines. They were everywhere, darting between dunes, racing down mountain trails, fording rivers the Germans said were impassable. The German soldiers began to notice. In intercepted letters and captured diaries, they wrote about the American vehicle that never stopped. They called it Das kleine Auto, the little car. Some admired it. Others resented it. A few tried to capture them intact, knowing that a Jeep was more valuable than a half-track in this terrain. By early 1943, the North African campaign was grinding toward its climax. The Germans were being pushed back into Tunisia, their backs against the Mediterranean. The Allies were closing in from the west and south. The terrain became more rugged. The roads, what few existed, turned into mud rivers after winter rains. And that's when the Jeep proved itself. Not in a single dramatic battle, but in 1,000 small moments. A convoy stuck in the sand, Jeeps pulling trucks free. A wounded soldier bleeding out in a foxhole. A Jeep racing across open ground under artillery fire to carry him to safety. A battalion cut off from supply lines, Jeeps hauling crates of ammunition and water through enemy-held territory at night. The Germans had better tanks, better artillery, better trained soldiers. But they couldn't keep up. Their half-tracks bogged down in mud. Their Kübelwagens couldn't handle the mountain passes. Their supply trucks required paved roads that didn't exist. The Jeep went anyway. In February 1943, the war in North Africa would reach a turning point. The place was called Kasserine Pass. It was where American forces would face their first major defeat, and where the Jeep would prove that mobility could matter more than firepower. The Germans were about to learn a hard lesson. You can laugh at something small, but small things go where giants cannot. Private First Class Eddie Slovik never thought he'd love a machine. He was a replacement, dropped into the 2nd Armored Division in January 1943 with barely 3 months of training. The desert terrified him, the emptiness, the heat, the way the sun turned metal into branding irons. He'd never driven anything more complicated than a delivery truck back in Detroit. Then they gave him a jeep. Not to drive. To ride in. The driver was a corporal from Montana named Haynes, who treated the vehicle like a living thing. He talked to it, patted the hood before every mission, called it Sally. Slovak thought he was crazy. Until the first time they came under fire. They were running supplies to a forward outpost, 2 jeeps for men, 100 pounds of ammunition and rations. Halfway there, German mortars started dropping. The road ahead erupted in dirt and shrapnel. Haynes didn't slow down. He yanked the wheel, veered off the trail, and sent the jeep bouncing across open desert. No road. No path. Just sand and rocks and the screaming whine of the engine. The mortars couldn't track them. Too fast. Too erratic. They reached the outpost in 12 minutes. The men there hadn't eaten in 2 days. Slovak understood then. The jeep wasn't just a vehicle. It was the difference between survival and surrender. It was the thread that held the front line together. Across the theater, soldiers developed the same connection. Jeeps had personalities. Some ran smooth. Some rattled like maracas. Drivers learned their quirks, which gear slipped in the sand, which turn required extra throttle. They painted names on the hoods. Iron Horse. Desert Rat. Lucky Strike. When a jeep broke down, men mourned it like a fallen comrade. The bond wasn't sentimental. It was survival. In a war where you couldn't trust the terrain, the weather, or the enemy's next move, you could trust the jeep. It would start when you needed it to start. It would climb when you needed it to climb. It would carry you home when everything else failed. The Germans didn't have that relationship with their vehicles. The Kübelwagen was reliable enough, but it lacked the versatility. The half-tracks were powerful but impersonal, machines that served a function, nothing more. There was no folklore around them. No songs. No nicknames painted in white letters across the hood. The jeep became part of the American soldier's identity. You weren't just a rifleman or a radio man. You were a jeep crew. And that meant something. The jeep wasn't designed for one job. It was designed for every job. In the morning it was a reconnaissance vehicle. Mounted with a radio and a map, it raced ahead of the main force, spotting enemy positions and reporting back. Speed was its armor. By the time the Germans realized it was there, it was already gone. By noon it was an ambulance. Medics stripped out the back seat and laid stretchers across the frame. A wounded man could be loaded in 30 seconds and delivered to a field hospital in under 10 minutes. Before the jeep, casualties waited hours for evacuation. Now they waited minutes. Survival rates climbed. In the afternoon it was a supply truck. Rations, water, ammunition, stacked high, tied down, hauled to the front. A single jeep could carry half a ton if you packed it right. Drivers became experts at Tetris with crates, balancing weight so the vehicle didn't tip on sharp turns. At dusk it was a weapons platform. Mount a .50 caliber machine gun on the rear pedestal, and the jeep became a mobile firebase. It couldn't slug it out with a Panzer, but it could shred infantry, disable light vehicles, and suppress enemy positions long enough for the main force to advance. British SAS units in North Africa turned jeeps into desert raiders, mounting multiple machine guns, stripping away unnecessary weight, and launching hit-and-run attacks on German supply lines. At night it was a lifeline. Convoys of jeeps moved through the darkness, headlights off, navigating by starlight and instinct. They carried messages when radios were jammed. They ferried officers between units. They rescued stranded patrols. The jeep could do everything except fight a tank, and even then it could outrun one. Tankers hated the jeep. Not because it was bad but because it made them look slow. A Sherman tank, 30 tons of steel and firepower, could barely manage 25 miles per hour on a good road. A jeep could hit 55. When the front lines moved, the tanks lumbered forward while the jeeps were already digging in at the next objective. Commanders loved it. They could be anywhere on the battlefield in minutes. Patton famously drove a jeep to the front lines during every major offensive, standing in the passenger seat, binoculars in one hand, riding crop in the other. He called the jeep America's greatest contribution to modern warfare. He wasn't exaggerating. Hauptmann Klaus Reinhardt captured his first jeep in March 1943. His platoon had overrun an American supply depot near Sidi Bouzid. Most of the enemy vehicles were destroyed, trucks burning, fuel drums punctured, ammunition scattered. But in the corner of the compound, under a camouflage net, sat a single jeep. Intact. Reinhardt had seen them before, of course. From a distance. Through binoculars. Little specks on the horizon, darting like insects. Up close it looked even less impressive. No doors. No roof. A steering wheel that felt like a toy. He turned the key. The engine coughed once and roared to life. He drove it back to his unit. Within a week, every officer in the regiment wanted one. The Kübelwagens were fine for roads, but the Jeep could go anywhere. The half-tracks were powerful, but they guzzled fuel and broke down constantly. The Jeep just worked. Reinhardt's commander requisitioned it for scouting missions. German mechanics studied it, taking measurements, sketching diagrams. They marveled at the simplicity. Four-wheel drive with a 2-speed transfer case. Leaf spring suspension. A flathead engine with 3 main bearings. Nothing fancy. Nothing fragile. Just functional. One mechanic called it the ultimate soldier's vehicle. Another said it was proof that American industry could outproduce German engineering. A third said they should have built something like it years ago. But they hadn't. And now it was too late. Across the front, captured Jeeps became prized possessions. German units painted iron crosses on the hoods to avoid friendly fire. They used them for the same tasks the Americans did: reconnaissance, supply runs, officer transport. Some soldiers wrote letters home, describing the strange little vehicle that outperformed everything the Wehrmacht had built. The propaganda ministry tried to downplay it. Newsreels showed German tanks crushing American positions. Radio broadcasts mocked American equipment as cheap and mass-produced. But the soldiers in the field knew better. The Jeep was better because it was cheap and mass-produced. The difference between the Jeep and the Kübelwagen wasn't just mechanical. It was philosophical. German engineering worshipped precision. Every bolt had a purpose. Every component was optimized. The Kübelwagen was rear-wheel drive because that reduced complexity. It had a lightweight body because that improved fuel efficiency. It was designed by Ferdinand Porsche's team, the same minds that would later create some of the world's finest sports cars. It was a masterpiece. But masterpieces don't win wars. The Jeep was designed by committees, tested by soldiers, and built by factories that had been making tractors a year earlier. It wasn't elegant. It was pragmatic. Four-wheel drive because you never knew what terrain you'd face. A simple engine because soldiers weren't mechanics. Interchangeable parts because supply lines fail and you need to cannibalize wrecks to keep the others running. American engineers didn't ask, "What's the best way to do this?" They asked, "What's the way that will work when everything else has failed?" The Germans built for the war they wanted to fight. Fast offensives on good roads, supplied by rail lines, supported by industrial centers that produced replacement parts on demand. The Americans built for the war that actually existed: mud, mountains, deserts, jungles, supply lines stretching across oceans, battles fought thousands of miles from the nearest factory. By 1943, the German military was feeling the strain. Spare parts were scarce. Factories were bombed. Fuel was rationed. Vehicles sat idle, waiting for repairs that never came. A broken Kübelwagen might wait weeks for a replacement differential. A broken half-track might be stripped for parts to keep others running. A broken Jeep was back in service by morning. This wasn't just a difference in design. It was a difference in how two nations thought about war. Germany believed in quality. America believed in quantity. Germany wanted perfection. America wanted good enough, in overwhelming numbers. And in the end, good enough won. The Jeep became more than a vehicle. It became a message. When German soldiers saw Jeeps rolling through captured towns, they saw proof that America's industrial capacity was unstoppable. These weren't hand-built machines. They were mass-produced. Thousands of them. Tens of thousands. And behind them, an ocean away, factories were building thousands more. For every Panzer IV destroyed, Germany could replace it. Maybe. Eventually. If the factories weren't bombed. If the rail lines weren't cut. If the fuel trucks made it through. For every Jeep destroyed, America built 10 more. 20 more. 100 more. The psychology of that was crushing. German soldiers in North Africa watched convoys of Jeeps stretching to the horizon. Endless. Unstoppable. They'd destroy one and 5 more would appear the next day. It wasn't just military defeat. It was the realization that they were fighting an enemy with resources they couldn't match. In letters home they wrote about it. Not with admiration. With dread. "They have so many," one soldier wrote. "We destroy their vehicles and they laugh. They have more." American soldiers felt the opposite. The Jeep was proof that the folks back home were with them. Every time a fresh batch arrived, gleaming paint, new tires, engines that purred, it was a reminder that Detroit was working overtime. That assembly lines were running day and night. That America's factories were the real weapon. Morale is fragile in war. Men fight harder when they believe they'll win. The Jeep was a daily reminder that the Americans would win, not because their soldiers were better but because their nation could outproduce any enemy. Even the Soviets noticed. Under Lend-Lease, America shipped over 50,000 jeeps to the Red Army. Soviet commanders called them the most useful vehicle of the war. They used them on the Eastern Front, across the steppes, through the Caucasus Mountains. Captured German intelligence reports noted that Soviet mobility had increased dramatically after the jeeps arrived. The jeep didn't just move soldiers. It moved hope. Wars are decided by logistics. And logistics are decided by terrain. The jeep didn't care about terrain. In North Africa, the sand defeated vehicles designed for European roads. Heavy trucks sank to their axles. Tanks overheated. Motorcycles tipped in the dunes. The jeep, with its four-wheel drive and low weight, floated across sand like a boat on water. In Italy, the mountains broke armies. The Apennines were a nightmare of narrow trails, sheer cliffs, and roads that turned to mud in the rain. German forces used mule trains to supply forward positions. The Americans used jeeps. Drivers learned to navigate paths meant for pack animals, wheels inches from cliff edges, engines screaming as they climbed grades that no vehicle should attempt. And they made it. In France, the hedgerows turned armored warfare into a crawl. Normandy's bocage country was a maze of sunken roads and earthen walls, perfect for ambushes. Tanks were blind. Infantry was slow. Jeeps slipped through gaps, scouted alternate routes, guided the advance. In the Pacific, jungles swallowed everything. Humidity rusted metal overnight. Mud turned roads into swamps. The jeep fought back. Its simple engine resisted corrosion better than complex German machines. Its ground clearance handled ruts and roots. Island by island, the jeep carried Marines and Army troops through terrain that should have been impassable. In Eastern Europe, the winter was the enemy. Soviet roads, barely roads at all, froze into jagged ice. German vehicles, designed for paved autobahns, struggled. The jeeps, shipped under Lend-Lease, kept moving. Soviet soldiers wrapped them in canvas tarps against the cold, mounted skis on the wheels in the deepest snow, and drove them anyway. The jeep didn't conquer terrain. It ignored it. That was the genius. Not power. Not armor. Indifference. Give it wheels and fuel and it would go. Anywhere. Always. The Germans never built anything like it. They came close. After the war they would study captured jeeps and design their own utility vehicles. But by then it didn't matter. The jeep had already won. February 14, 1943. Kasserine Pass, Tunisia. The Americans were about to learn how much they didn't know. The pass was a narrow gap in the Atlas Mountains, a natural choke point between the eastern and western halves of Tunisia. Holding it meant controlling the interior. Losing it meant retreat to the coast. German commander Erwin Rommel knew this. The American generals, still new to desert warfare, were learning it the hard way. At dawn, Rommel struck. Panzers rolled forward. Mark IIIs and Mark IVs, their 75mm guns punching through American M3 Lee tanks like tin cans. German infantry followed in half-tracks, machine guns chattering. Stuka dive bombers screamed out of the sky, dropping bombs on supply depots and artillery positions. The American line bent, then broke. Units scattered. Communications failed. Officers lost track of their men. Tank crews abandoned burning vehicles and ran for the hills. It was chaos, the kind of chaos that ends wars before they've really begun. But the jeeps kept moving. Sergeant Michael O'Hara was a medic attached to the 1st Armored Division. When the Panzers came through, his unit was caught in the open. No cover, no support, nowhere to run. Men fell. Screaming. Burning. O'Hara grabbed the nearest jeep, a beat-up Willis with a cracked windshield and a transmission that ground like gravel. He drove toward the firing. Not away. Toward. He loaded 3 wounded men into the back, their blood soaking into the canvas seats. A shell landed 20 yards to his left, showering the jeep with dirt and shrapnel. He didn't stop. He floored the accelerator, bouncing over rocks, weaving between destroyed vehicles, racing back toward the aid station. He made it. Dropped off the wounded. Turned around. Drove back. 4 more trips. 12 men saved. On the 5th trip, a German machine gunner spotted him. Bullets stitched across the hood, punching holes through the thin metal. The windshield shattered. O'Hara kept driving, hunched low, one hand on the wheel, the other reaching back to steady a soldier whose leg was gone below the knee. The machine gunner stopped firing. Later, in a captured diary, a German soldier would write about the American medic who drove, like a madman, without fear, without hesitation. He didn't shoot again. He let him go. O'Hara wasn't the only one. Across the battlefield, jeeps became lifelines. They evacuated the wounded. They hauled ammunition to isolated positions. They carried messages when radios went dead. They pulled supply trucks out of ditches. They raced ahead of advancing Panzers, marking enemy positions for artillery strikes. The Germans won the battle. They pushed the Americans back 30 miles. But they didn't break them. Because the Americans could retreat faster than the Germans could advance. Jeeps carried entire companies to safety, bouncing across open desert while Panzers ground to a halt, their fuel tanks empty, their crews waiting for supply trucks that were still miles behind. German commanders watched in frustration as American forces slipped away, regrouped, and dug in again. One German officer, captured weeks later, was asked what surprised him most about the Americans. "Their little cars," he said. "We couldn't catch them." The battle at Kasserine was a defeat. But it taught the Americans something. Armor and firepower weren't enough. Mobility was everything. The army that could move fastest, adapt quickest, and supply its troops reliably would win. And the Jeep was the key to all of it. By March 1943, the tide in North Africa was turning. The Germans were surrounded. British forces pushed from the east. American forces from the west. Rommel, sick and exhausted, was recalled to Germany. The Afrika Korps was trapped in a shrinking pocket around Tunis, their backs to the sea. But the terrain was still brutal. The final battles weren't fought on open desert. They were fought in the mountains, narrow passes, steep grades, roads that turned to mud whenever it rained. The Germans dug in, using the high ground to slow the Allied advance. Every ridge was a fortress. Every valley a killing ground. The Jeeps climbed anyway. In April, near the village of Fondauk, American forces needed to supply an infantry battalion that had seized a hill overlooking a German strongpoint. The only route was a goat trail, barely wide enough for a man on foot, let alone a vehicle. Trucks couldn't make it. Mules were too slow. A Jeep driver named Corporal James Lawson volunteered. He stripped everything non-essential from the vehicle. Removed the seats. Took off the doors. Even unbolted the spare tire. He loaded the Jeep with ammunition crates, stacked high, roped down, and started climbing. The trail was worse than expected. Rocks jutted out like teeth. The path switched back on itself every 50 yards. In some places the wheels hung over open air. Lawson drove in first gear, engine screaming, sweat pouring down his face. He made it. 3 trips. 600 pounds of ammunition. The battalion held the hill. German observers watched through binoculars. They couldn't believe it. Later, a captured German report noted that American reconnaissance vehicles possess extraordinary off-road capability, exceeding our estimations. That was the moment. Not a dramatic explosion or heroic charge. Just a small vehicle doing something impossible, and doing it so routinely that the Americans didn't even think it was remarkable. By May, the Germans were finished in North Africa. Over 250,000 Axis soldiers surrendered. It was the first major Allied victory of the war. Newsreels showed Sherman tanks rolling into Tunis, infantry marching in formation, commanders shaking hands. But behind the cameras, Jeeps were everywhere. Hauling supplies. Carrying wounded. Transporting prisoners. Linking units scattered across 100 miles of front. Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, watched a convoy of Jeeps rolling through the city and turned to an aide. "That," he said, "is why we're winning." The German commanders who survived the campaign were interrogated by Allied intelligence. One question kept coming up. What surprised you most about American forces? The answers varied. Some mentioned artillery. Others mentioned air support. But many mentioned the Jeep. "They were never stuck," one officer said. "We would block a road and they would drive around us. Through fields. Through rivers. It was infuriating." Another called it the most dangerous weapon the Americans had, not because it killed Germans but because it made the American army impossible to pin down. The war in North Africa was over. But the Jeeps' war was just beginning. Italy was next. Then France. Then Germany itself. And everywhere the Americans went, the Jeep went first. In the summer of 1943, Allied forces invaded Sicily. The terrain was worse than Tunisia: steep mountains, narrow coastal roads, villages perched on cliff sides. German defenders used the landscape like a weapon, forcing the Allies to fight for every mile. The Jeeps adapted. They hauled supplies up mule paths. They evacuated wounded from villages under artillery fire. They carried engineers to blown bridges, where they'd survey the damage and radio for pontoon boats. One famous incident involved a Jeep crossing a river the Germans thought was too deep. The driver, a private from Oklahoma named Billy Reeves, wrapped the engine in canvas tarps, sealed the distributor with grease and drove into the water. The Jeep went under, completely submerged for 30 seconds. Then it emerged on the far side, engine sputtering but still running. Reeves delivered his cargo, radio equipment, and drove back. A German machine gun nest had watched the whole thing. They didn't fire. One soldier later said they were too astonished. By September, the Allies were on the Italian mainland. The fighting became a brutal slog. Mountains, rain, mud, and an enemy that refused to quit. But the jeeps kept moving. Through snow in the Apennines. Through flood-swollen rivers in the Po Valley. Through rubble-choked streets in Cassino. The Germans tried to copy it. In late 1943, Volkswagen received orders to develop a vehicle similar to the Jeep. They produced the Type 82E, a four-wheel drive version of the Kübelwagen. It was better than the original, but by then Germany's industrial capacity was collapsing. They built fewer than 600. The Americans built 6,400 Jeeps. Every day. In June 1944, the Allies invaded Normandy. The Jeeps were in the first wave, waterproofed, engines sealed, driven off landing craft into chest-deep water. They carried officers, radios, and medical supplies. They towed anti-tank guns. They marked routes through minefields. And when the breakout came, when the Allies finally smashed through the German lines and raced across France, the Jeeps led the way. Patton's Third Army advanced so fast that supply lines couldn't keep up. But Jeeps could. They raced ahead, carrying fuel in jerry cans, ammunition in the back, messages scrawled on paper maps. They moved faster than German reinforcements could react. By August, Paris was liberated. By September, the Allies were at the German border. And everywhere, in every photograph, in every newsreel, Jeeps. The Germans had stopped laughing. By the end of 1944, the Jeep had become ubiquitous. Over 640,000 were built during the war. That's more than any other military vehicle in history. They served in every theater, Europe, Africa, Asia, the Pacific. They drove through deserts and jungles, across mountains and beaches, over roads and rivers and terrain that had no name. The numbers were staggering. American forces alone had over 360,000 Jeeps. The British received 30,000. The Soviets got 52,000 through Lend-Lease. Canada, Australia, Free France, and a dozen other Allied nations used them. Even China received thousands, using them in the fight against Japan. The production was a marvel. At peak capacity, American factories built one Jeep every 90 seconds. Ford's River Rouge plant alone produced over 277,000. Willis made the rest. The assembly lines ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Workers, many of them women who'd never set foot in a factory before the war, bolted together frames, installed engines, painted hoods, and rolled finished vehicles out the door. Each Jeep cost $738.74. Less than a single artillery shell. Less than a week's salary for a factory worker. And each one saved lives. Casualty evacuation times dropped from hours to minutes. Before the Jeep, a wounded soldier in North Africa might wait half a day for an ambulance. With the Jeep, medics could reach him in 20 minutes and have him in surgery in an hour. Survival rates for battlefield injuries increased by 30% between 1942 and 1944. The Jeep was a major reason why. Supply efficiency skyrocketed. Before the Jeep, moving ammunition from a depot to the front line required trucks, which required roads, which required engineers to build and maintain them. The Jeep just drove. Across fields. Through forests. It didn't need infrastructure. It was infrastructure. Communications improved. Radios were useless if you couldn't reach the unit that needed information. Jeeps carried officers, messengers, and radio operators to wherever they were needed. A general could visit 3 battalion headquarters in an afternoon. Coordination, once a nightmare of delayed reports and outdated maps, became real-time. The Germans noticed all of this. In captured documents, Wehrmacht officers analyzed American logistics with a mix of admiration and despair. One report, dated October 1944, concluded, "The American advantage is not in their tanks or artillery, but in their ability to supply and move forces at a speed we cannot match. The vehicle they call the Jeep is the foundation of this capability. We have no equivalent." Another intelligence assessment, found in the archives after the war, was blunter. Each American division has more motorized transport than an entire German corps. Their light vehicles operate in terrain we considered impassable. Recommendation: develop similar capability immediately. But it was too late. WWII 1944 Germany's factories were under constant bombardment. Raw materials were scarce. Fuel was rationed. The infrastructure that had made German industry a powerhouse was crumbling. Even if they'd had the blueprints, and they did from captured Jeeps, they couldn't build them in meaningful numbers. Meanwhile, American production accelerated. Eisenhower called the Jeep one of the three tools that won the war, alongside the Dakota transport plane and the landing craft vehicle personnel, LCVP. General George Marshall went further. In a speech after the war, he said the Jeep contributed more to American victory than any other piece of equipment. Patton, characteristically direct, said, "The Jeep is the only vehicle that could keep up with my army. Everything else was too slow or too fragile. Give me enough Jeeps and I'll drive to Berlin by Christmas." He almost did. In December 1944, the Germans launched their final offensive, the Battle of the Bulge. A surprise attack through the Ardennes forest, aimed at splitting the Allied lines and recapturing the port of Antwerp. Weather grounded Allied aircraft. Snow blocked roads. German panzers pushed deep into American positions. But the Jeeps kept moving. They carried ammunition through blizzards to surrounded units. They evacuated wounded under fire. They towed anti-tank guns into position. They delivered orders when radios failed. In the town of Bastogne, encircled by German forces, Jeeps were the only vehicles that could navigate the frozen, cratered streets. When the weather cleared and reinforcements arrived, it was Jeeps that led the counterattack, racing ahead of the tanks, scouting routes, marking enemy positions. The Germans were pushed back. Their last gamble failed, and the Jeep had been there in the snow and mud and chaos, doing what it always did, going where it was needed when it was needed without hesitation.